everyone. I'm Kelly Weiss. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at King Hall. Thank you so much for joining us for our Racial Justice Speaker Series. We have a wonderful guest with us today. I'm just going to go over some quick housekeeping rules. We're going to have everyone on mute throughout the event. We will take questions at the end of Professor Lenhardt's talk, and you can just put those questions in the chat. They'll come directly to me, and then I will pose the questions to the professor. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Kevin Johnson to start our event. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kelly, and thank you all for being here today. We soon will have Georgetown Law Professor Robin Lenhardt deliver our annual Bodenheimer Lecture on Family Law. Her talk today will be part of our Racial Justice Speaker Series as well. Now, the Bodenheimer Lecture was established in 1981 to honor Professor Brigitte Bodenheimer, a renowned scholar, teacher, and law reformer. The lecture brings leading scholars to UC Davis, although it's virtual this time, to discuss recent family law developments. Professor Lenhardt specializes in matters pertaining to race, family, and citizenship. Her lecture today is entitled "The Family and Inequality Debates." She will discuss her argument that families, especially those of color, should be at the center of efforts to understand and address structural racial inequality. Now, racial inequality, of course, has been at the center of the national conversation of police brutality, the criminal justice system, and healthcare disparities. Systemic racism is unfortunately corrupted our nation's history. And for that reason, UC Davis School of Law is presenting a Racial Justice Speaker Series to acknowledge that tragic history, its legacy, and in hopes of furthering the conversation and to seek solutions. Professor Lenhardt's talk is the third of the series, which will run all year. Now, before joining Georgetown Law, Professor Lenhardt was a law professor and director of the Center on Race, Law, and Justice at Fordham School of Law. She clerked for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer and Judge Hugh Bounds of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. At Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, Professor Lenhardt was part of the litigation team that defended the University of Michigan in lawsuits challenging its race-conscious affirmative action programs. She's also worked as a staff attorney for the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and an attorney advisor in the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel. Professor Lenhardt holds a degree from Brown, 2 from Harvard, and an LLM from Georgetown Law. Please welcome Professor Robin Lenhardt.
Good afternoon. I am truly honored to be able to be part of this speaker series, and of course to be given this tremendous Bodenheimer lecture opportunity. It means a great deal to me, and it means even more because I am so thrilled to have been introduced and invited by Dean Kevin Johnson. He's been a friend for many years and an invaluable mentor for me as well. He truly helped me find my way into the academy, and I am so grateful. I'm going to share my screen so that you all can see my slides here. Before I start, I want to sort of set our table, if you will. So indulge me while I read a passage from a Gwendolyn Brooks poem. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. And I start with that because I thought it was so apt to begin a conversation about family, race, and inequality with a poem that includes those words and written by that wonderful artist, and in many ways activist Gwendolyn Brooks. This summer, the family of George Floyd, the African-American Minneapolis man who was tragically killed at the hands of white police officer, did something unusual, maybe even remarkable. The family members of George Floyd took their demand for justice to the UN's Human Rights Commission. Now, with the killings of Michael Brown and Ferguson and Breonna Taylor, so many people over these years, we have all unfortunately become a little accustomed to seeing people, seeing family members in mourning. But what struck me over the years is that those family members have largely been seen as a backdrop to a larger stage, a larger play, if you will. When we talk about racial justice today, we are usually talking about institutions and systemic inequality, institutions that perpetuate that inequality in areas like criminal justice, housing, or education. Or we might be also talking about individuals, say a Trayvon Martin, or a group of people, African Americans or Latinos, if you will. But amidst that sort of those groupings that I mapped, we rarely hear people talk about the family as an institution that we might need to attend to. Families, however, are, as I said, largely ignored, and they are not regarded as a useful unit of analysis when it comes to thinking about inequality in this country. Now, all of this is a little strange when you think about it, because historically, family, the institution of a family, had been used to mark people as or to race people, if you will, and to also subjugate them, whether it be through immigration or other forms of regulation. So I want to invoke that history for a moment, because my sense, as I work on these issues in a book about a case that I will talk to you about in a moment, is that focusing on the family as a useful unit of analysis when it comes to thinking about structural racism, structural inequality, and its effects is something that we should try to do more and more. And there's a way in which focusing on the family in the way that I suggest allows us to go to the bottom, to borrow a term from critical race theorists. What I hope to do today is to convince you that the sidelighting of family that I've described is a mistake, and that we should be actually centering the family particularly families of color, in our discourse about structural racism and inequality. Doing so, I can contend, can help us to better understand how structural inequality works, and then, of course, to develop strategies or solutions that are better suited to address it. Now, before I get to that piece of the talk, I want to discuss with you the US Supreme Court's decision in Moore versus City of East Cleveland, a case on which with which I should say I become obsessed, I admit it. And that has led me to a book project that explores that case and its impact. Eager to escape the vice grip of Jim Crow segregation, Inez Moore was the plaintiff in the Moore suit, did what millions of other African American migrants did. She left the South and went north. More significantly, or more specifically, I should say, she went to Cleveland, Ohio, and a town, a city that actually has been the site of many important cases, Terry versus Ohio, for example, or Mapp versus Ohio, involving race. Now, not surprisingly, Cleveland, the Cleveland that she found herself in, had some problems. Many of them that were very similar to those that she and others had encountered in the South. Segregated white spaces were maintained and policed by whites during that time. Living conditions for African Americans were often poor, and securing housing and other necessaries became so different with the crush of migrants looking to escape, difficult as with the crush of migrants looking to escape the South, that tensions soon flared. This is Inez Moore. I'll show you that quickly. I'll come back to that picture for you. And what happened is that in 1968, frustrated by those conditions, African Americans in Cleveland took to the streets to voice their dissent. Now, that protest, which led to the deaths of African Americans, white police officers, was among those incidents that the Kerner Commission mentioned in its report, which famously concluded that our country is moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. Now, eventually, Inez and her family were forced to move to neighboring East Cleveland, a town that shared a border with Cleveland, and was a place where at one time very wealthy whites treated as a sort of destination place. By the time Inez Moore arrived, however, East Cleveland had become something different. It had become a site of tremendous racial change, with white flight being a huge issue in the jurisdiction, discriminatory practices such as block busting, and an influx of African Americans who were attracted to the beautiful architecture that they found there at the time, in part because of the low cost of housing as more and more Blacks came in. Now, unlike other towns, East Cleveland was unique. Many towns and municipalities were very happy to utilize discriminatory mechanisms. East Cleveland said, we don't want to do that. And in fact, they hired a consultant to help write a report that sort of mapped out their priors and what they were willing to do to preserve an integrated or to create an integrated community. But they also were clear that they wanted, for lack of a better word, to maintain a measure of whiteness in the Cleveland space, even as many of the leaders at that time were African American, so very relative to Inez Moore and others were well off or better off economically. But they too were willing to engage in pretty rigorous regulatory efforts. Now, like many towns, East Cleveland limited occupancy in buildings. Let me make sure. A little bit. Go back to Inez. But they did something else that made East Cleveland unique. And that was that they used a very cramped definition of family in determining what kinds of extended family units could reside in the area. I'm not sure that you will be able to see the actual regulation because it's hard to see from afar, but I will tell you that essentially what East Cleveland did was they criminalized certain types of extended family formations. Because Inez Moore lived with her adult son, Dale, his young son, Dale Jr., and her other grandson, John Jr., whose father sometimes resided with them, Inez Moore and her family ran afoul of that definition of family and of that housing regulation. When the housing inspector came by on multiple occasions, Inez Moore refused to evict her grandson, John Jr., who had been designated an illegal occupant, according to the housing inspector. So, cutting to the chase, Inez Moore, a grandmother in her late 60s at that time, and somebody who was partially disabled enough to stop working, faced jail time and a fine for not removing her grandson from her house. Now, the Supreme Court eventually heard this case, Moore versus City of East Cleveland. Justice Powell ended up writing the main opinion, concurring opinion or the plurality opinion, if you will, that said that the City of East Cleveland zoning regulations were violative of the 14th Amendment's due process clause. Justice Powell, in his opinion, concluded that East Cleveland's regulation simply cut too deep into the family. Now, significantly, the Supreme Court made no mention of race in this opinion. Justice Powell certainly did not, but most of the other justices did not either. Apart from the issues that I already described, there were, however, many places where race had been an issue in the case and in the city overall. So I'll just sort of list those to give you a feel for how much race, even though it wasn't directly part of the justice's discourse, was very much part of the case. First of all, the zoning ordinance that was at issue in the case was one that had been adopted just 5 days after the uprising in Cleveland that I described to you. The leaders of East Cleveland went into a closed door session and changed the definition of family to the very restrictive one that I described earlier. So they were concerned about, and this came out in the report that the consultant put out, they were concerned about border jumping as a term that they use, and about bringing in lower income residents who might not, in the minds of these officials, might not uphold the standards that they wanted. So there was that. There were also problems in the schools during this period. If I can, you might not be able to see this slide. I might be able to do it at the end of the talk. Tremendous racial change in the schools, going from, for example, having a handful of African Americans and an overwhelming number of white students in the schools, to having a complete flip. And what the school officials did as a way of really trying to regulate African American families in the jurisdiction was to require caregivers who were not official guardians to become official guardians. And many of them resisted this, and they did so with the help of Inez Moore, who got a set of Cleveland legal aid lawyers to help her. And she was successful in bringing this class action that they eventually closed. But race was a big issue there as well. And in fact, the enforcement of the zoning measures, as I suggested, was also one that was very raced, in the sense that they were trying to sort of maintain what they understood to be a respectable community. I would say, again, another effort to sort of maintain the whiteness of what that had long been part of that space. And then finally, there was the fact that behind the scenes, the justices themselves, even though there are only a couple of little tiny references, Justice Brennan mentions race and the importance of African-American families for their family members as a way to sort of move through difficult times in his concurring opinion, and a couple of other small mentions. There's not very much about race in the actual opinion, which is why most, or many, I should say, family law teachers, instructors, and also many con law professors do not treat Moore versus East Cleveland as a race case. They treat it as a family law case, but for reasons that I'm hoping I can convince you of, I think it is very much race. And the fact that the justices behind the scenes were trying to work out how to think about race, how to think about intentional discrimination, how to determine whether it's possible. There's a sort of a colloquy back and forth among the justices in the papers from the Supreme Court that I received, where they were questioning essentially, can Black people discriminate against one another? And this is important because, again, Moore comes 1 year after Washington versus Davis, which many people call the most one of the most consequential decisions that the Supreme Court has made. And I would add, in my view, wrong decisions that they have made. It also comes, Moore comes just a few months after Arlington Heights, which is a decision that Justice Powell, who played a very prominent role in many of the race cases of this era, and unfortunately one that was very restrictive when it came to the recognition and use of race in certain contexts. He wrote Arlington Heights. And then just a year later, the court decided Bakke, which of course, among other things, was very clear with Justice Powell writing again that so-called societal discrimination could not be recognizable. So Moore is in many ways a family law case. But in my mind, or to mine, I should say, I think it is also one of the most important race-based Supreme Court decisions that the court has made, because you really see the justices trying to work through in their memos between back and forth to one another, how to think about race in this new landscape. Now, I definitely, this is Justice Powell here, I will not be able to read everything that that is written here, but I will tell you that this is a draft opinion. Initially, Powell was writing a dissent, and there were lots of changes, vote changes in this cases, and he ended up writing the plurality. Up above on the upper right, there's a note from his clerk about the case and whether he could join an opinion that I think it was that Justice Brennan had written that had racial overtones. And Justice Powell says, it's a great opinion, but I can't join it, in part because of the very sort of minor way in which race was addressed. So all of those things point to Moore being a case that is very important when it comes to thinking about race and thinking about family as well. What I want to do is I want to come back to this and stick a pin in some of what I've just said, because I do think that there are lots of very tasty morsels for those of you who are interested in really trying to unpack what happened in Moore and to sort of trace the court's evolution around thinking about race and intentional discrimination. I think there's more to be said there, but I want to sort of move along to advance sort of the fuller part of the argument that I set out for you in the very beginning. And I want to do that by having you think about a totally different case. This is a case involving Walter Scott, who was an African-American man who lived in North Charleston. And he was stopped one day by a white police officer. And that police officer shot Walter Scott in the back as he ran away from this very minor traffic stop. So what we first learned about, I don't know how many of you remember this case, but it really stood out for me. And it's in part because what I learned about Walter Scott after he was shot. And that is that he ran away from the police officer after this very routine stop because he owed back child support. And he was afraid that if he got arrested and couldn't pay child support, that he would have to go back to jail. He'd been to jail at least one time for this. And that he would lose a very good job that he had secured. Now, I think had many people, that sort of background was fleshed out by some New York Times editors or writers. And I think had his situation been understood earlier, we would have had a much richer, a much deeper understanding, not only of Scott's particular circumstances, his situations, but also sort of the larger context in which many families of fathers of color find themselves in this context. Now, Tanya Brito is a law professor at Wisconsin, has done really important work in thinking about the ways in which child support decisions often land African-American men and others into the kind of bind that Walter Scott tried to seek out. But she really sort of teased out this very problematic relationship between what happens in criminal justice context, what happens in child support and other related issues. And I offer this case up because I think it will help to see the ways in which, or at least I hope I can convince you that it helps us understand the ways in which centering the family in current debates about structural inequality. So Walter Scott was not, and even today, even with the sort of additional information about what was going on, he's just listed as one of the criminal justice guys, right? Got caught up in the system. But what I'm suggesting is that a broader understanding, a deeper understanding of what structural inequality meant for him, for his family, and the ways in which it worked is critical and is something that we should put at the center of current conversations about race and inequality. Both the Scott and the Moore examples help to underscore how incomplete in lots of ways, certainly our equal protection doctrine and the conversations that we have around equal protection are very impoverished because we don't have a real clear avenue, and I say this as a family law professor, for thinking about race and family in the ways that I think would be most productive and be most helpful to the Walter Scotts and the Inez Moores of the way. But they're both, I think, help to underscore how much more we need to sort of fill in the gaps when it comes to thinking about families, what families go through and what they need. Now, to try to clear or to map out clearly the difference a family-centered approach might do, I want to offer, might achieve, I want to offer 2 slides. Now, I'm not paying attention to time. So if I'm running over, Dean, please let me know. But I think this slide for me is useful in that I think it maps onto the way that the Moore case was decided. So I told you a number of factors that made Inez Moore's circumstances difficult. And yet what we get out of even this family law decision is really just a focus on housing and how you define the family in this context. And Justice Powell's opinion sort of adopts a very traditional, whitewashed understanding of family. He says, well, sort of Inez Moore is in the same boat as Irish and Italian immigrants who came decades before. They're all the same. But what I want to offer instead is a slide that looks like this as a way to talk about what the Moore family was experiencing. So certainly there are issues of housing, but there are more than that. And in a paper that I'm writing for the Wisconsin Law Review, I sort of put together, I won't say they're fabricated, but I've sort of taken true elements of the circumstances of members of the family who were living with Inez Moore, and she actually had an adult daughter and a grandson who lived on the second home of the duplex that Inez Moore had managed to purchase, and tried to sort of fill in the gaps. So Inez Moore, yeah, she had housing issues, but in the narratives that I write out, there were also employment issues for Dale Jr. There were food insecurity issues for other members, healthcare issues, wealth, insufficient wealth issues, environmental issues, right? You can imagine a whole scope of concerns that intersect when you come to a family like Inez Moore's. So what I think you get is something much richer and much more useful and more true to the complicated lives that certainly that families generally, but especially families of color who were living at the bottom experience. When you consider the concerns that I've laid out or tried to set out, what you get, or I guess one way to think about the prior slide that I showed you is a much, I think, much more complex understanding, and one that we should embrace, because as we know, that the ways in which race operates in this society, it's not linear. It's multifaceted and shape-shifting, for lack of a better word, changing constantly. And what we need, I think, is a way to capture that, to respond to that reality, and then to generate solutions that will help address them. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not gonna go on too much longer, because I'm hoping that we can have a conversation. I will tell you that what you see before you, before I move on, is to the right here, this sort of open lot is where Inez Moore's house used to stand. It was razed many years ago, but to the right is where her home stood. I went to East Cleveland and drove around and took some pictures. I'll share this last one too with you before I move on. This is, I don't think it's fair yet to call myself a book writer, because I'm still very much aspiring to that. But I will say that when I got to that open lot and was able to take this picture, I was thrilled. So the school across the street from what was Inez Moore's house was called the Superior School. That's where eventually John Jr. and Dale Jr. Attended classes. And because I have to assume that the name of the school was Superior, the teachers and administrators and children decided that they should build a Superior family garden. And that just seemed right on point for me. And I guess as I get to the end of our conversation, or this talk, at the beginning of our conversation, I'll just say that I think that what I'm looking to do in suggesting that we center the family in our discussions about racial inequality in this society. And I'll just, as a slight aside, think about our major civil rights organizations. How many of them put not just family members, but family units on their websites where they're talking about addressing discrimination? See voting, see housing, see education, and there are families, of course, behind all of those. But it will be hard, I think, to find many of the major sort of standard civil rights organizations that prioritize the family in the way that the UN commission that George Floyd's family went to does. And I think that that should give us all pause and make us think first, what do we need to do to ensure on a regular basis that we are speaking to, conscious of, and addressing in a deep way the circumstances that families of color find themselves in. And what you might do in thinking about this is something along these lines. When you do often see family members mentioned, it's often in the criminal justice context. Much of the research on criminal justice reforms talk about what it will mean for individuals, what it might mean for some groups, but not necessarily, or at least to the extent that I would like to see, families. So with a family lens, we could change that and begin to look much more broadly at the effects of incarceration. So with a family lens, for example, we could begin to think, of course, about the person the individual who's incarcerated, but also to think about the ways in which their incarceration touches other family members. That it might affect the educational experience of children. It might have an effect on employment for an adult care giver. I could go on, but hopefully those examples give you a sense of how you sort of build out and begin to insert the family into our thinking in a way that we currently do not. The lens I'm trying to utilize here in thinking about families is one that ultimately I think will also give us a deeper understanding of how inequality works. And I said that before, but I want to underscore it because I think that's critical for families, and it's very much at the heart of what I'm trying to advance here. In the recent months, we've had some good work around COVID and families, mostly around just the issues around health, some issues around employment as well. But I think we can build on that to get a better understanding of what's happening, and also ultimately a better conversation, and hopefully at some point a more useful doctrinal set of tools than we have now. I also think, and then I really will stop, that what centering family in the ways that I'm suggesting can do is to offer solutions that are different and more useful than some of those that we now have at our disposal. So you can think about, for example, thinking about how you deal with. Well, I'll give you an example that hopefully will be useful for you. I sit on the board of an organization that is called the Bail Fund, and the Bail Fund decided that they don't want to just focus on bailing people out of jail. That instead, what they wanted to do is to think about the systems, and they have a project that is focused on women and women of color in particular, to say, yes, we want to ensure that you have bail, but we understand that the family unit of which you are part has multiple needs. And so in addition to the lawyer we would get you for your bail, efforts to get bail, we'll find another person who can help you deal with the fact that you may lose your job. And we'll find another person to help you with the caregiving that you won't be able to provide because you're the sole caregiver for not only your children, but your mother, maybe cousins. The idea is to sort of get a very holistic approach and an innovative approach to the concerns and issues of families that are locked into inequality in lots of ways. And ultimately, even as I become more and more enamored with the Moore case, that is also where I want to end up. And that is in part because what has inspired me to follow this case and to think about these issues are my own Inez Moores, my grandmothers who made that trip from the South in search of a new life and found barriers of race that limited them in ways that were problematic from them, but because of their efforts, that I was able to circumvent is the word I'm looking for. So I'm very grateful to them and very grateful to all of you for listening to this presentation and to my thoughts on the subject. I look forward to your questions and maybe even some disagreement. I'm ready for that too. Thank you.
Yes, so please send questions to me. I've had some come in already and we're about up on time, but I want to get to at least one of them. We had a question come in from Professor Courtney Jocelyn, a distinguished family law professor here at UC Davis. And she writes, yes, as someone who thinks that all law is family law, I am so appreciative of this project, a project that seeks not only to help us see how families and family law is part of the struggle for racial equality, but indeed seeks to center the family in that pursuit. So first, thank you for this important project. Second, I'm hoping you can identify some specific law reform endeavors that an interested legislator might pursue to ensure that, as you say, they are conscious of and addressing the needs of families of color.
It's great to hear your question. Courtney, I really appreciate your being here for this, and I appreciate the question as well. So I'm trying to, I don't have a specific law reform, but I will go back to what I suggested before, which is to have initiatives that are intentionally working intersectionally, so that we want to deal with the circumstances of a Walter Scott. You could say we only want to ensure that he, does not go to prison for the offense. But if you take what I'm suggesting in the idea of centering, you're really trying to get at all the sort of crossroads, if you will, that he and his family members endured. So you're looking at sort of multifaceted solutions. The bail fund example is another one. So you could just have a lawyer for bail, or you could have 4 lawyers that really address the needs of the individual. And so I think those 2 examples get at what I would like to see in law reform and are innovative in the way that I'd hope for.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Karina who says, would you say that a breakdown in families or lack of focus on the importance of families results in a societal breakdown? or perhaps it results in society's failure to place a high value on families?
Uh, I think the latter, if I'm getting your question correctly. I'm less focused on blaming families for things that are not going well, and more attuned to thinking about the things that interrupt the functioning that I think all members of a family want. So that's where I would focus my efforts, and that is what this project, not just the paper that I mentioned, but the larger book project is really about. What does it take to ensure that families and family members can be successful, and more broadly, because race is so much at the center of my thinking and my hopes in this area. What can we do to ensure that family members can navigate and evade or escape, I guess is the word I'm looking for, the inequality that keeps them from moving forward.
Great, thank you. And this will be our final question here. We have another question from a faculty member, Professor Jasmine Harris. And she writes, I think your work on the family has tremendous overlap with disability cases. In addition to Inez having an intersectional identity as a person with a disability and being a Black woman, the use of guardianship laws in education has been used to disenfranchise people of color and people with disabilities. What are your thoughts on applying an intersectional lens to these cases when we center the family?
I think that's really important. Your question is making me think about the work that my former colleague at Fordham does, Kamani Paul Emil. She does a lot of work around race and disability, and using disability laws as a way of advancing racial justice. And in fact, we're working on a short piece now that is going to get at that. So I agree with you that that's something that should be part of the discourse. And I thank you for the reminder as well.
Mhm. Great. Let me, Dean Johnson, I have one other quick thing to put in because this might be something people want to check out. We have a question from Susan who says, has the professor seen the new film called Time about a family impacted by their father's incarceration? It's on Amazon Prime, and she says it's exactly on point to this discussion. Is that something you're familiar with?
It is not something I'm
Okay.
familiar with, and I'm really happy to have that suggestion.
Great.
Thank you
Okay, thank you.
very much.
Thanks so much, Professor Lenhardt. You've given us a lot to think about. We appreciate your time. And now we have a movie homework assignment that we get to pay some attention to.
Good.
So, but thanks again, and thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.